Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan and welcome to Words in Time. Now in today's video, I'm going to be pitting sci-fi books from the 1950s against the 1960s. Now, in order to compare 2 decades worth of books would obviously be rather subjective and would require me reading hundreds if not thousands of books. So instead what I'm going to be doing is comparing my 5 favorites against my 5 favorites. So I'm going to be revealing my top 5 favorite books from each decade, and then I'm going to make them compete head to head. So number 5 against number 5, 4 against 4, and so on until my favorite book of each decade are going up against each other, and I'll be forced to pick winners until we have a best of 5 winner in round 1 of my sci-fi decade bracket challenge. So let's get started with our first matchup. Alright, so my 5th favorite sci-fi book of the 1950s is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. And that's going to be going up against my 5th favorite sci-fi book of the 1960s, A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. So, starting with Fahrenheit 451, some of the arguments for that would have to start with the prose. I think Bradbury is an excellent writer, and this is actually the only book that I've read by him so far, but I'm really interested in reading The Martian Chronicles next. I think there's some interesting sci-fi concepts and themes, and it can be interpreted in a number of different ways, which I think shows the strength of how thought-provoking and long-lasting the impact has been from this book. Now, when it comes to A Clockwork Orange, I think the language in that book is also a strength. Perhaps not so much the prose, but the way that Anthony Burgess created new words, mixed some languages to create some slang, such as droogs and fun words like that, which was a big part of the success of the film adaptation as well. A Clockwork Orange is a little darker than perhaps the tone that I normally go for in my books, but the ultra-violence, the heavy themes, the concepts of free will and the violence and identity have really stuck with me over a long period of time. Perhaps aided by the Stanley Kubrick film, but I think the book stands on its own pretty well by itself. This is a tough one. I think in terms of the plot, I lean slightly more towards A Clockwork Orange. Fahrenheit 451. Too many F's in that title. Yeah, that's going against it in my scoring system. I think it had its moments, but I perhaps wasn't as hooked the whole way through as I am with some other dystopian classics like 1984 and Brave New World. Although it's not going up against those books, it's going up against A Clockwork Orange. But A Clockwork Orange, I thought was pretty tight and not perfect all the way through, but I think it hits a number of memorable moments and interesting beats. So for that reason, I'm going to lean towards A Clockwork Orange. So that makes the score so far after our first round matchup 1-0 to the 1960s. Let's get on to the second. Okay, our second matchup is my 4th favorite sci-fi book of the 1950s, The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester, going up against my 4th favorite sci-fi book of the 1960s, Dune by Frank Herbert. Now, I know some of you might be a bit surprised to see it that low, but I do enjoy Dune, and it did make my top 5 of the decade, so you'll have to stick around to see which 3 I like even more than Dune. But here we go. Let's start with The Star's My Destination. I think one of the strengths of this book is its sci-fi themes and concepts. One of my favorite of which is the concept of jaunting. Now, this idea of a kind of limited form of teleportation I thought was really cool, and it wasn't just used as a fun mechanic. The way the book explored how that would impact society as a whole as well, I thought was really, really well done. I thought the plot moved at a reasonable pace, took me to some interesting places, but oh man, some of the characters in this book are pretty unlikable, and for me that took it down just a notch. When we're looking at Dune, I got to give Dune the edge in characters. Paul, Jessica, and others are pretty iconic characters for a reason. The world building in Dune is absolutely fantastic. One of the richest worlds in sci-fi history, and the themes and concepts, I don't know, I think if I had to pick one, jaunting might be my favorite of any in either two, but Dune, I think there's just a lot more that you can draw from. Are there any drawbacks for Dune? Well, For me, the plot did move at a rather slow pace, and I found the prose at times to be a little bit dry, Arrakis pun intended, but I think overall it's the stronger piece of work. It's the one that I think about more, and if I had to reread one of the two, I think I would go with Dune. So, after 2 rounds, that brings the score to 2-0 in favor of the 1960s. Can the 1950s make a sci-fi comeback? Let's find out. Moving on to the third matchup, we have my third favorite sci-fi book of the 1950s, Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, going up against my third favorite sci-fi book of the 1960s, 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. So, starting with Flowers for Algernon, this is a light sci-fi book, some light speculative fiction, if you will, but I thought the idea of a man with low intelligence undergoing an experimental surgery to improve his intelligence, and then seeing the progression of that, and then the potential downfall after the mouse Algernon that the experiment was initially tested on, he starts to go downhill. The questions of whether that will happen to Charlie, our main character as well, to be so engrossing. I was so invested in this story because of Charlie as a character. I was really connected to him, endeared by him, and the way in which the story is told through the journal entries, seeing the transformation in Charlie as a character, both through the plot and the journal entries themselves, I thought was absolutely fantastic. I think the plot was a little predictable, a little thin perhaps, but that's not really the focus. The focus is on the ideas and on the characters. So when it comes to 2001: A Space Odyssey, very different book. The focus is not on the characters at all. This is big idea sci-fi. We are in space, we are dealing with questions of existence, infinite universe, possible alien species. It's sci-fi at its most classic. So what did 2001: A Space Odyssey do well? Well, it really got me thinking about those ideas. I really enjoyed the technology in the book, how one of the most famous artificially intelligent robots or pieces of technology in the spaceship is iconic for a reason. One of the best parts of the film and the book. Also, that ending had the wheels in my brain churning for days. Some people like it, some people don't. It's perhaps a little bit open-ended, but it gave me just enough to really want to wonder more about those final few pages. So, which way am I going to lean? This is a tough one. I've actually done reviews for both of these books, so if you want to hear more on either of these, check out those reviews. I think I'm going to have to go with Flowers for Algernon purely for the emotional impact. The ending of this book is one of the most impactful endings of any book I've ever read. I haven't stopped thinking about it since. If I keep on talking about it, I'm going to start to cry. So there we go. Point to the 1950s. After 3 rounds, the score is now 2-1 in favor of the 1960s, but the 50s are still in the fight. Let's move on to the fourth matchup. And with our fourth matchup, we have my second favorite sci-fi book of the 1950s, The Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut, going up against my second favorite sci-fi book of the 1960s, Ubik by Philip K. Dick. So, 2 big names there, 2 of my favorites. Let's compare them, starting with The Sirens of Titan. So, there is so much going on in this relatively short book that you could claim that it's a bit all over the place or a little bit unfocused, but I loved the amount of concepts, ideas, technologies, characters, locations that Kurt Vonnegut managed to cram and fit all together in this tight little package. This book had a pretty massive impact on me in terms of the way that I look at things, the types of things that I want in my sci-fi books. Kurt Vonnegut was an early influence on me as a sci-fi reader, and yeah, this really set the bar in terms of ideas, emotional impact, individual lines of dialogue. There's so much that I can pull from and remember from this book, and it's my second favorite of the decade, and in my top 5 Kurt Vonnegut books. If you want to hear the rest of those, go check out my top 5 Kurt Vonnegut video. Now, moving on to Ubik. This is an interesting one because I would say that this one is also a little bit inconsistent, perhaps, in the sense that Sirens of Titan is perhaps a little bit up and down throughout the book, whereas Ubik, I didn't really connect with the first half that much. I liked it, I thought it was interesting, and then the second half just blew me away. I think this is a tale of two halves. The second half of Ubik, also a relatively short book, only around 200 pages. That second half is one of my favorite 100-page stretches ever. I think the ideas, the concepts, similarly a strength of Ubik. The prose is relatively matter-of-fact, but I think it serves its purpose in terms of conveying a rather grounded feel. It's interesting how kind of a down-to-earth telling of a kind of insane story actually I think works quite well. So I love both of these books. It's pretty hard to choose. If I have to pick one, which I do because I'm making myself do it, that's the video. One of these has possibly my favorite chapter ever and one of my favorite quotes ever. So even though I don't think it's consistent all the way through, for its sheer high points, one of the biggest emotional impacts on me as a reader, and I think me just more broadly as a person, I'm going to go with the Sirens of Titan. I'd like to share the quote with you now, but it's a little bit long, so go check out my top 10 Kurt Vonnegut quotes video if you want to see what it is. But Sirens of Titan, yes. Whew. Wow. Okay, we're 2-2. 1960s 2, 1950s 2. It's going to come down to the final books, my number one from each decade. Let's check them out. So here we are with our fifth and final deciding matchup. We have my favorite sci-fi book of the 1950s, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, going up against my favorite sci-fi book of the 1960s, Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. Now, both of these are repeat authors in the video, although I did limit each list to one book per author. So Clarke and Vonnegut each had one book in each decade, so pretty interesting little stat there. This one's going to be tough because these two are both two of my favorite books of all time. I don't really have strong critiques of either of them. It's just going to be a matter of whether I can pass out my favorite aspects, see if I can find one that is stronger between the two. So, starting with Childhood's End, I think this is big idea, big concept sci-fi at its best. The first part of this book had me intrigued. It was kind of interesting, and I think it's been a big influence on other sci-fi works after it in the future. The second part had me thinking, okay, this is going in an interesting direction. This is something kind of different to what I've read before. And then part 3 just absolutely blew my mind. It's one of my favorite endings of all time. I think the way that it takes things that affect characters and people on a local level, an individual level, and then blows it out to a global level, and then blows that out onto a universal level, an existence level. It absolutely took my breath away. This is one of my favorite books ever, and the fact that it's the prose is a bit dry, the characters are a bit thin, I don't care, because this is focused on the ideas and it nails them better than almost any other sci-fi book I've ever read. Now, when it comes to Cat's Cradle, Kurt Vonnegut is so funny. I think this is one of the funniest books that he's written. I think it's one of the most poignant books that he's written, and I love how it takes a look at rather serious things like war and free will and death and religion, and looks at them through a rather absurdist lens. I love how Kurt Vonnegut is able to take serious subject matter and make it poignant and funny at the same time, because sometimes comedy is the only way that we can really deal and process with that kind of subject matter, and it worked so well for me. I connected with him so much as a writer. As difficult as it is to compare these two books, I think I could actually boil both of them down to just 2 words. For Childhood's End, those would be what if. And for Cat's Cradle, they would be what is. Childhood's End really just got my mind running about my place in the universe and all these kind of crazy hypothetical sci-fi concepts and questions. Whereas Cat's Cradle had such a personal connection and impact about my place in the world, how I connect with other people, and I think both books ask questions without claiming to have all the answers, but simply for the pure fact that I think Cat's Cradle had a bigger impact on me as a reader and a bigger impact on the person, I'm gonna need to go with Cat's Cradle. I think they both execute what they were trying to do almost perfectly, but if I'm forced to pick one, Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. So there you go, the final score is 1960s 3, 1950s 2. 1960s holds off the comeback from the 1950s in order to win the first round of my Sci-Fi Decade Bracket Challenge. That was tough, but that was a lot of fun. I got to talk about some of my favorite books, and hope you guys enjoyed hearing about them, and I'll be very interested to hear what some of your favorites are as well. If you enjoyed this video, I will be doing more. I will have more first round matchups. I'll be going through the decades, and then we'll have a finals where we narrow it down to my favorite sci-fi decade of all time. So I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe because, as always, there's more sci-fi content coming soon.